This is Lindsay McDougall on ABC Illawarra.
And yes, the Regional Cities New South Wales, as I was saying, an alliance of 15 cities across the state working to improve livability and productivity in rural areas. And despite excluding Wollongong from joining that exclusive club, we have got to mention, though, in a pre-budget submission to the government, Regional Cities New South Wales are arguing for improvements to Port Kembla. But why? What does Port Kembla have to do with Packsaddle? Mathew Dickerson, the chair of Regional Cities New South Wales, joins us now. Welcome back to ABC Illawarra.
Thanks, Lindsay. It sounds like I've got someone noses out of joint there with Wollongong not being included there. Have I offended some people, have I?
Not at all. No, we're quite used to being excluded from things, but normally it's people forgetting to mention Port Kembla when they talk about other ports, such as the Port of Newcastle and Port Botany. But what are the different reasons that it's been mentioned? Why do farmers and businesses based way out west need to use the facilities here at Port Kembla?
Well, Port Kembla is an important port, but I think the really important thing here is that all of regional New South Wales and regional cities across New South Wales need to make sure we've got access to multiple ports. So Port Kembla gains a mention there because it is a big port for grain exports. So for people that are typically, if you drew a line through the middle of New South Wales across the state, then a lot of the area down south of that line would use Port Kembla, and again, it is big for grain exports there. And obviously part of the plan going forward is as containers start to get to the stage of capacity, and some may argue they're at that stage already for Port Botany, then the plan, the big picture plan is that containers will start to go via Port Kembla. Now they're saying that's not till the year 2041, but many people would say that needs to happen a lot sooner than that. I think the real picture here, Lindsay, is about the three ports, Newcastle, Botany, Kembla. We think that it makes sense to have all three ports operational and building some resilience in the network so that you've got access to not just one of those ports, maybe not just two, but all three, depending on what you might be transporting, but also depending on what else might be happening with various weather conditions, with various issues that occur throughout the state. I think they're all three are very important.
All right, so, and there is a lot happening at Port Kembla, which we'll get to in a second, but how would you like to see Port Kembla's capacity upgraded? What needs to happen?
Well, certainly in terms of the ability for it to service containers in the short term would be good. Obviously, Newcastle there was legal issues that the government had to sort out with Newcastle. They sound like they've mainly been sorted out now. There needs to be a bit of money paid, but we'll leave that to the state government to sort that part out. But certainly containers would be an important part of it. Also, just increasing overall capacity and access to Port Kembla. Can get very congested at Port Kembla. And when we saw some weather incidents that occurred last year, for example, there was some landslips and some issues there in the Blue Mountains, that obviously restricted access. So just having multiple points of access. So it's not just about the port, it's about getting product to port as well. And that's certainly something that we see in Port Botany with the amount of congestion going in through Sydney.
Yeah, but I mean, and as you've described in your budget submission, there's when it comes to train tracks, passenger trains and freight trains often need to share the same track. That can lead to delays. Trains have to wait and sit up while oncoming trains pass. That's costing money. Can you give us an idea of how much those delays are costing producers?
Well, delays going into Port Botany, in the information we gave to the government around the budget submission, we have an estimation that about $300 per container is what it costs when someone's trying to get some containers into Port Botany. They can be delayed by up to 12 hours. And you're right there in terms of those train networks. Only 5% of all those rail paths around Sydney trains are allocated to freight, and 4% is available on an ad hoc basis. So over 90% is focused there on passengers, and that makes sense. But again, if you're trying to get some things from regional areas into port, then that can be a major drama getting it through there. So there is a real cost. It's not just, it's a bit annoying, it's a real cost. $300 per container adds up when you think about the number of containers that end up at Port Botany.
Yeah, and as it says here that Port Botany nor Port Kembla are equipped to handle the more efficient large freight trains. So there is that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's all part of that overall upgrade, Lindsay, trying to make sure we're there, we're competitive. When you've got producers in New South Wales who are producing products for the world market, you've got to make sure you're competitive on the world market. So it's no longer good enough to say, well, that's about as good as we can do, it'll all be okay. When you add that cost to each container, when those products are being sold internationally, those producers need to be competitive. So we really want to make sure that all of the processes we've got are competitive. As much as the producers, the farmers are trying to make sure their products are competitive, it needs to be competitive on a worldwide scale.
And what can you do about things like you mentioned, the train line, the Blue Mountains becoming unusable, the ground washed away underneath the tracks? I mean, climate change touches many different parts of daily life. Rail corridors are no different. How do you want to see that resilience addressed?
It really is multi-access. So it's if you've only got one way to access a port, for example, or you've only got one port that you can use for your products to get out there, that's all okay when things are working okay, but when something happens, when anything happens, we're going to see more and more of these weather impacts, then suddenly that can knock out an entire chain. So you want to be able to have multiple ways to access multiple ports. And so that's where we think Port Kembla is important, as is Port Botany, as is Newcastle. Again, if you've got 3 ports to access and you've got multiple ways to access each of those 3 ports, that makes more sense from our perspective. And the rail network is how much of that occurs. Obviously, there's some road as well, but having access to that rail network in there all makes sense. Keep in mind too, something that many people probably aren't thinking about, but we're talking about getting products that are grown in regional New South Wales out to port to get to international markets. But we've got a lot of renewable energy that's being touted in terms of renewable energy zones out around inland areas at the moment. There's going to be a lot of products that are going to be built. Now, obviously, you produce steel. You've got products you can produce out of steel in Port Kembla. Getting some of those products out to, for example, regional areas. You've got Central West Arana, renewable energy zones, the most advanced. Some of those products, if you build some of those towers, you just can't get them on road or rail and get them where they need to go. So they might need to go from port at Port Kembla to Newcastle Port by the ocean, and then from there in via road or rail. So it's important for actually getting those products into New South Wales as well as getting them out of New South Wales.
Yeah, you've made a mistake not putting a port at Macquarie River in Dubbo,
That's
obviously.
right.
That's the
well, when your last
main
surf
problem.
report said it's pretty flat, I'm thinking, well, looking at my window is pretty flat as well at the moment.
Look, I'm talking to Mathew Dickerson, who, in addition to being the Mayor of Dubbo, is also the Chair of Regional Cities New South Wales. Just finally, you've mentioned Port Kembla and having it as one of these the priorities, but there's so much else happening at Port Kembla. There's the wind turbines support. There's maybe a nuclear submarine base, a new container terminal. How do you order these projects correctly to maximise potential?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And one of the things from our perspective is we don't believe it's our spot to get down to the nitty-gritty detail and tell the government how to do every little thing. And they're probably not going to listen to us at that level of detail. The most important thing from our perspective is we've got a group of 15 cities. We think they're a very important part of our overall state from an economic point of view, from a population growth point of view. So it's really about making sure they remember that we exist. And sometimes you can get some people who get in Sydney and forget about anything else existing outside of Sydney. So it's really about remember we're here, remember some things that are important. And by the way, the ports are really important to what we do overall for the state. So you, as the government, you go and plan the detail and get all that right at the minutiae level. We're just saying, remember us, hey, we're here. Don't forget about the things that we need. And that's a really important part of it.
We won't forget you here, Mathew. In fact, we'll probably hear you later in the week or next week with Nick Reinberger as well.
Quite possibly.
Awesome. Thanks. Good to talk to you, mate. Cheers.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Mathew Dickerson there, the Chair of Regional Cities New South Wales.